Animated Mishaps, Episode 3, The Great Molasses Flood. You have probably heard the phrase slow as molasses. It is supposed to mean something harmless, sluggish, lazy, incapable of hurting anyone. On January 15, 1919, the city of Boston learned that this phrase is a lie, a deadly, terrifying lie. On that day, a wave of molasses 40 feet tall swept through a neighborhood at 35 miles an hour. It was not slow. It was faster than you could run. It killed 21 people. And the reason it happened is a masterclass in doing everything wrong. Our story begins in Boston's North End, a crowded, busy waterfront neighborhood packed with homes, workers, and horses. Looming over all of it was an enormous steel tank, 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide. A giant metal can sitting right next to where people lived and worked. Inside it sat 2.3 million gallons of molasses. That is roughly 13,000 tons of thick, heavy brown syrup. Now, you might ask why anyone would store an ocean of syrup in the middle of a city. The answer is alcohol. Molasses was used to make industrial alcohol, which was used to make munitions. There was a war on, and syrup, strangely, was a war material. So the company that owned the tank had every reason to keep it full. What they did not have, apparently, was any reason to build it properly. The tank had been built in a hurry back in 1915. The man overseeing its construction was a company finance man named Arthur Gell. Arthur Gell had one small limitation for someone building a giant tank. He could not read a blueprint. He did not hire an engineer to check the design. He did not hire an architect. He just trusted that the numbers on the page were probably fine. When the tank was finished, there was a standard, obvious safety test available. Fill it with water first, to check for leaks before trusting it with thousands of tons of syrup. That test would have used a lot of water and taken some time. So Arthur Gell skipped it. He filled it with a few inches of water instead, glanced at it, and called it good. The very first time the tank was filled with molasses, it leaked. From day one, brown syrup oozed out of its seams. Local children noticed the leaks. They came by with cans and cups to collect the free molasses dribbling out of the side of the tank. The company's clever, world-class engineering solution to a leaking tank was as follows. They painted it brown so the leaks would not show. And so the tank stood there for years, groaning, leaking. Painted to hide its own warning signs, a disaster patiently waiting for the right day. That day was January 15, 1919, and the weather set the trap. Boston had been freezing cold for days. Then, suddenly, the temperature jumped. It became unusually warm for January. The tank had also just been topped up with a fresh, warm batch of molasses 2 days earlier. Warm syrup, a straining tank, a sudden temperature swing. Just after lunchtime, people nearby heard a strange sound, a deep rumble. Then a series of sharp pops like a machine gun. Those pops were the tank's rivets shooting out of the steel like bullets. The metal was tearing itself apart. And then the entire tank gave way at once. 2.3 million gallons of molasses came out all at once. It surged out in a single enormous building-high wave. Witnesses said the wave was 25 to 40 feet high. Picture a 4-story building made of syrup falling on a neighborhood. And it moved at around 35 miles an hour, far faster than anyone could run. There was almost no time to react. The wave was so dense and heavy that it did not just splash. It smashed. It crushed buildings flat. It lifted houses off their foundations. It tossed wagons and horses like toys. It even tore down a steel support of the elevated railway running through the neighborhood. The train tracks dropped toward the street. A nearby firehouse was hit so hard it was shoved off its base. The firefighters were trapped inside. And here is the cruel part. Molasses is not water. You cannot swim through it, and you cannot climb out of it. It is thick, sticky, and heavy. Anything caught in it was held in place, like an insect in amber. As the molasses began to cool in the January air, it grew even thicker and harder to escape. The trap tightened by the minute. Rescuers arrived to a nightmare. The entire scene was waist-deep in sticky brown syrup, and every step they took, they sank. Sailors from a nearby ship, police, and Red Cross nurses waded in. Ordinary neighbors joined them, pulling people out of the muck. It was slow, exhausting, filthy work. Rescuers were soon as stuck and coated as the people they were trying to save. By the time it was over, 21 people had died, and around 150 were injured. It was a genuine tragedy, and it deserves to be remembered as one. The cleanup was almost as staggering as the flood itself. The molasses had hardened over everything. crews used salt water from the harbor to slowly break the molasses down. They hosed the streets, the walls, and the rubble for weeks. The harbor near the north end reportedly stayed brown all the way until summer. And for years afterward, locals swore that on hot summer days, the whole neighborhood still smelled faintly of molasses. But the story was not over, because now everyone wanted to know one thing. Whose fault was this? The company that owned the tank had a bold and creative answer ready. It was not their fault, they claimed. It was anarchists. Their official theory was that someone had snuck in and blown up the tank with a bomb. Anything, apparently, was more comfortable than admitting they built it badly. This led to one of the largest and longest legal battles Massachusetts had ever seen. More than 100 lawsuits were bundled together into one giant case. For years, the hearings dragged on. Hundreds of witnesses testified. Engineers were brought in to examine the wreckage of the tank. The engineers found no evidence of any bomb. What they found was a tank with walls too thin and steel too weak for the job. The tank had never been safe. It had been overstressed from the very first day it was filled. The pops people heard were not a bomb. They were the metal finally giving up. After years of testimony, the official finding came down. The company was at fault. The tank was the problem, and the anarchist story was nonsense. The company was forced to pay out a large settlement to the victims and their families. It was, for the time, an enormous sum. And the disaster left a mark far beyond Boston, because everyone realized the same horrifying thing. A finance man who could not read a blueprint had built a giant tank with no expert ever checking it. So the rules changed. After the molasses flood, building plans had to be reviewed and signed by a certified engineer or architect before construction. It became standard across the country. The simple idea that someone who understands the math should sign off on the thing that might fall on people. It is the kind of rule that sounds almost too obvious to need writing down. And yet, like so many safety rules, it was written in hindsight and paid for in lives. Today, the site of the tank is a park. There is a small plaque, easy to miss, marking where the flood happened. Most people walking past have no idea that this quiet spot was once buried under a 4-story wave of syrup. The Great Molasses Flood is now remembered as one of the strangest disasters in American history. Deadly serious and completely absurd at the very same time. It is a reminder that cutting corners does not always cause a small, quiet problem. Sometimes it builds up silently for years behind a coat of brown paint. And it is the reason that, to this day, the phrase slow as molasses should come with a small, serious asterisk. Because on one cold January afternoon in Boston, molasses was the fastest, heaviest, and most dangerous thing in the entire city. Thanks for watching Animated Mishaps. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and follow at Animated Mishaps for more true stories that sound completely made up. See you next time.